Hi everyone. So recently when I played the early access version of Diablo 4, I collected some pretty insane loot. And I think this is a good opportunity to show you guys what kind of crazy items you can actually find in Diablo 4. Especially for those of you that have played the game already in the open beta or the server slam, you will have a bit of an understanding of what means good and bad, I guess. So I collected a few different screenshots and just kind of go through and like talk my way through them to give you a bit of an understanding of the types of items that you can find or potentially trade with other people. In this picture, we have an example of an item that I found at just level 62, and it was a pretty massive upgrade. So you can see here level 62, my character, and the item has exactly the same requirement of the character level when you found it, with a certain minimum level. So there are sacred and then ancestral items that you can find in higher difficulty tiers, and they are effectively beefed up versions of these items, a bit like ancients in Diablo 3, but a lot more common. So they're kind of like standard drops, I guess, after some time. So it kind of seems to like scale up, at least from what I can tell. You seem to find like more and more of these items on higher tiers, and eventually just have like full ancestral loot, and they can roll a higher item power. And 807 is the base item power roll of this item, which is very close to the maximum. I believe that the maximum item power you can find is 820 or 815 or something like that. So I have found 811 myself. So this was pretty close to the highest item I've actually found in the entire time. But not only that, you can also upgrade them through the blacksmith, and each blacksmith upgrade gives an item plus 10% of the base value. So you can get plus 50% on these stats if you upgrade them 5 times, which however is relatively expensive, at least on the last upgrade. So you can't really do this like all the time, but 3 upgrades is absolutely no problem. 4 upgrades, nothing really crazy. And then the 5th one is something where you have to invest a few more mats and you have to actually go out of your way to farm them. But either way, you can see that this item gives you almost up to 60% potential critical strike damage. There's core skill damage that can roll up to 30%, and you can get something like 95 on your main stat or 42 on your all stats. These are pretty insane values that can massively boost your damage. And of course, the DPS is pretty high because the DPS scales directly with the item power. Here's another example of a pair of pants. So I actually found a really good one after I already had acquired a pretty good one. You see here on the left is the one I have equipped. This was 705 item power, and I upgraded it plus 20, which if you have seen my blacksmith upgrading video, is actually the next threshold for higher tier stats. So even though this is a sacred pair of legendary pants, you can upgrade it through the 725 threshold and get ancestral tier stats. So this is what I have done, and I had a really good pair of pants here. You see this amount of damage reduction, 20% damage reduction from close enemies. This is literally a legendary affix. And that's just 1 out of the 4 affixes on this thing. I also had this total damage reduction, I had total armor or damage reduction from distant enemies. So I had both, basically everything covered with the damage reduction here, which is essentially a legendary affix that is up all the time unconditionally. And I had like even more damage reduction here. Well, you can see this, for example, I had found a new pair of pants that had also close to the highest item power of 804. And it also had damage reduction mod with a really good roll. It had damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, which can go 14% baseline. So with upgrades, you can get 21% there. And then you could still get something like total damage reduction or damage reduction from close enemies for a melee build. That with the last upgrade would be almost 25% or something like that. So I think that's actually what I've done later. I have like this screenshot here exactly. So I rerolled this item at the occultist, and I actually managed to roll percent total armor, which is also a pretty useful defensive stat. And then I had plus 4 ranks to Dark Shroud and 3 of these insane defensive stats. So that thing alone made me so tanky. It was actually pretty crazy. Obviously, I was still able to die, and you kind of need good defenses, guys. Let me stress that. Here's another example of my chest piece that I had. That one was also pretty sick. So you can see it can get up to 60% resistances of one resistance type on something like a chest. I think also helms and boots and a few other pieces roll these. You have to know that resistances do scale down on the higher world tiers. So on Torment difficulty, which you're gonna spend most of your time on in the end game, those resistances are actually reduced by a certain percent. And then also only half of the resistance is applied to your actual damage reduction. So this 60% might seem extremely high, but in the end, it does actually scale down quite a lot. But at least against poison damage, this is a very powerful affix to have. So if you want to kind of like specialize your character, for example, against certain dungeons, against certain bosses or something like that, these resistances are quite valuable. But outside of that, usually other damage reduction stats that are a bit more like broad are better. For example, this damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, yet again, damage reduction from close enemies, or even maximum life. At this point of level 64, I didn't have that much life on my character. I had like 3,000 life or something like that. So, and then you get like 1100 life almost on top of that. It's like a third extra, which is a pretty crazy amount. Obviously, maximum life will not stay that powerful because as you level, you get more life, and then each additional life that you add from items just becomes worth a little bit less relatively. But even so, at level 80, my base life wasn't really all that much higher. It was like maybe 4, maybe 5k or something like that. I expect at like level 100, you're gonna have maybe a baseline of like 6, 7, 8k or so. So even then, a 1000 extra life roll is quite a lot, like 15%. Here I have a screenshot of some amulets. So one I was using, I think this is actually the one I just kept using all the time. Man, it's really hard to find good amulets. In general, amulets have the highest RNG by far with how many different affixes there are. And a lot of them are relatively bad, but a lot of them are also very, very good. And of course, you want to try to get some combo of at least 3 really good stats on your items so that you can finish it with rolling the last stat to whatever you want. But this is a quite expensive endeavor, and even if you get this 3 good stat, 1 bad stat amulet, you're not really guaranteed to actually make it great because of the super high cost and the high RNG on this item. But you can see that, for example, in the late game, you can solve your resource issues relatively easily with your amulet. You have up to 23.7% energy cost reduction. The same applies for the other classes. You can get a lot of resource cost reduction there. You can also get a bit more on the boots, for example, but it's a much lower roll. There's also resource generation on rings, for example, that can help you with that. But in general, this is a very powerful roll for any build that requires resources. Then there again is total armor. You can roll certain passives, for example. So especially like offensive passives are present on these amulets. And you also have stuff even like movement speed, for example. Or again, those defensive stats like damage reduction from close enemies, total damage reduction, all this kind of good stuff. I think that in general, your amulet is going to be the piece that is going to be the most imperfect for most of the time that you're playing. I think this is really the hardest to acquire piece because there are so many different roles and you don't really find too many amulets. I'm not sure if there's like fewer of them. It's also not that easy to gamble them because they have a relatively high cost. So this is really one thing to look out for. Whenever you play, you want to pick out those amulets. I was even picking up the lower tier, like the sacred tier amulets, just because they can roll such crazy RNG with really great combinations of stats. Here's a screenshot of some gloves. So I was using this one with +4 ranks for twisting blades. This is post upgrade. This is the highest amount of ranks you can get. So +4 to your skill. And I was mostly trying to show off here the extra stats they can find on the higher tier items again. So for example, we saw those passives on the amulets. They can only appear on the high item powers. And similarly on the gloves, you have, for example, these lucky hit effects. There's chance to slow, there's chance to restore primary resource. Unfortunately, this is a very low chance, so I'm not really sure if this primary resource stat is really great. But the slow, on the other hand, is actually pretty good in my opinion. So with an upgrade and a good roll, you can get 30% lucky hit to slow. And this can trigger various other effects. For example, if you otherwise don't really have any kind of CCs, or at least soft CCs, you can apply slow to an enemy, and this will not trigger the monsters to become unstoppable, and you can get the benefits of damage to crowd-controlled enemies, damage to slowed enemies. You can have something like the cheats legendary aspect that gives you damage reduction from crowd-controlled enemies. So there are various effects like that that can make a stat like this very valuable. But I also want to highlight a few more stats here. So there's the critical strike chance on the glove that can roll up to 12% with 5 blacksmith upgrades. So this is a massive amount of crit you can get there. And then the rings, I think they can have something like 8% each or so. So you can get a really good chunk of crit. And there's also stuff like trap skill cooldown reduction. I've also seen imbuement skill cooldown reduction, for example. So there are certain like category specific cooldown reduction values that you can stack and potentially just speed up your gameplay quite a lot. In general, stuff like energy cost reduction, movement speed, and cooldown reduction really picks up in the late game. You get really high values on some of those stats, as I have shown here with this amulet, with the energy cost here or movement speed on the boots. I think I have an example somewhere here. So here we have up to 26.2% movement speed on the boots. So this is already a really sizable value if you consider that plus 100% is the actual cap that you can reach, including all of your legendary effects, including temporary bonuses from your skills or anything like that. You can get over a quarter of the cap's value just from those boots. And then there's also this other stat here, like movement speed for 4 seconds after killing an elite, which has a higher value than just a permanent movement speed. And this can go also to 42%. So I think that especially for something like necromancers, this is going to be one of the top combos to have on boots. You want to have both of these movement speed affixes so that you actually can move, anywhere basically as a necromancer. But even those other affixes are pretty interesting. You have +3 maximum evade charges. So you can just like hop around all the time. You can do attacks reduce evade cooldown by 1.2 seconds. That is a massive cooldown. So it's like 3 attacks and you get it back pretty much. And I'm not really sure if this even works with the Sorcerer's Enchantment teleport. So that would be kind of interesting to know. If that does, then that would be pretty insane, I believe. Here's an example of a really good ring that I found that I used for quite a while. So this was maximum life, crit chance, and resource generation. You see again 18.5% resource generation, and this applies to any kind of resource generation, be it passive or active or from procs or anything. So together with the energy cost reduction, for example, you can really do some miracles and definitely don't require like a basic skill anymore on a lot of builds, at least on a rogue. I think that also, especially those classes that do have any kind of passive generation of resources, will actually try to basically just drop basic skills from their setup for the most part. And you see here the crit chance can go up to like 7.5%. There's also crit damage, there's vulnerable damage, there's quite powerful affixes on rings. In general, rings do suffer a little bit from the same problem as amulets. There's also a lot of trash stats. For example, here we have physical damage, which actually does work for my build here, so it wasn't like useless. But generally you want to try to avoid these additive damage affixes in favor of some of these, very impactful affixes. Like here's a maximum life roll again. Yeah, again at level 77, this gave me probably something like at least 20% extra EHP. And then we had resource crit. So these are the stats that you're looking for in these rings. Here's an example of a two-handed weapon that I used on one of my builds. So I think the values are similar on melee two-handed weapons, but either way, we have a juicy chunk of 60% vulnerable damage and 63% up to 70 actually. Again, you can get 130% vulnerable damage just from your stat stick if you are playing a melee rogue, for example. This is pretty crazy considering that vulnerable as a whole is actually a damage multiplier. So you can stack something like 300, 400, maybe up to 450, 500% vulnerable damage total if you have it everywhere and like mega maxed out with the exploit glyph and all that. So you have an insane damage multiplier there. And also those other values you see here, damage to crowd control up to 50%, core skill damage almost 60%, can roll really high values, and also like 189 dexterity. So if you're planning your Paragon boards right now, then yeah, you can definitely count on some of those, especially two-handed weapons and some of those armor slots to kind of carry you there if you want to try to stack the all stats or your main stat a little bit. And the last item for now, here's another amulet. I wanted to show this off mainly because of this ranks to all subterfuge skills. So we have +2 ranks here, and this can actually be upgraded to +3 with the 5th upgrade at the jeweler. And of course you can save a lot of skill points or just get a lot of value from a roll like this. This kind of ties in with the point I was making about the other amulet earlier. And again, you can see that a lot of the more interesting stats are also coming back here. So here have this trap skill cooldown reduction again. So we had that on the glove. You can also have this on the amulet. You can have 15% there, 15% here. And then you can have some base cooldown reduction on the helm as well for another 50% there for all of your skills. and suddenly you can actually reduce the cooldown of your traps by something like 40% or something like that. Your death trap that usually needs like 50 seconds is going to be like 30 instead. And again, we have another example here of like a really bad roll. So this would be the one stat to replace the imbuement skill damage. Not only because this build that I was running wasn't really using imbuments, but also because this is, you know, compared to these other stats that you can find on Amulets, just a really kind of low damage value. With all of the additive damage that you have in an endgame build, something like this 18% damage roll will be, I don't know, maybe like a few percent, like, you know, 2% damage increase or so overall. And there are definitely some of these other more powerful affixes that you can roll that will help you build a lot more. So these are some of the most crazy items I found when I was playing the early access. I only reached level 80, so I wasn't like fully decked out, you know, end game, everything best in slot. But you can definitely tell that on your way there, you can acquire some pretty crazy stuff. I hope that with my showcase here, I was able to educate you a little bit about what kind of items you can find and what is kind of valuable and what is good and why. So obviously there's a lot more stuff to discover. There are a lot of crazy combinations of items you can have. And I think it's going to be pretty wild to see like a fully decked out, fully min-max character in action that is just going to like destroy everything that the game has. But I guess that's probably okay once you have reached the absolute end. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.